Hello, so this little section of the video is on the heart. Now, the main job of the heart is to pump blood around the body. It's going to pump it to two main areas. The lungs, which we're going to put up here, and the rest of the body, which we're going to put down here. Now, if you look at the heart, it's split up into four main areas. We've got the two atriums at the top and two ventricles at the bottom. Now remember, if you're looking at somebody straight ahead, it's like you're looking in the mirror. So what you count as your right hand side is actually the left hand side of their heart, which means that the right is also on the opposite. So this is the right hand side of the heart, this is the left hand side. So at this side we've got a left atrium and a left ventricle. Over here we've got a right atrium and a right ventricle. Now we basically need to know what vessels come in and out of each part, and also the name of the valves which separate each part. So if we look at this, what happens is blood flows from the lungs back to the heart in the pulmonary veins. So these two things here are the pulmonary veins. You've got two of them because you've got two lungs, so one comes from each lungs. That carries blood from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Now the left atrium is basically a really thin small chamber which pumps blood down to the left ventricle. But before it gets there, it has to go through a little valve. Now on the left hand side of the heart, it is called a bicuspid valve. Sometimes they are called atrioventricular valves. And they are just there to separate the blood from the left atrium and the left ventricle. And it basically means as well that when the left ventricle contracts, it stops blood flowing backwards. So the blood's come back in the pulmonary veins, it's going into the left atrium. The left atriums contract and push blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then contracts and pushes blood upwards and out through the aorta. Now, as well as that, just on the diagram here, this is the wall of the left ventricle, which we'll come back to later on, and this is the septum, which separates the left and the right hand side of the heart. Now, if we move on to the right hand side of the heart, so remember this was over at the right, the main blood vessel that carries blood back to the body is the back to the heart from the body is the vena cava. Now we've actually got two here. You've got one here, a vena cava, which is from the head, and a vena cava here, which is from the rest of the body. They join up in the center part, which is the right atrium. So the right atrium is coloured in blue here, as is the vena cava, because it's got deoxygenated blood. So it's going to pump, the right atrium is going to pump blood from there into the right ventricle. Now this time it goes through a tricuspid valve. Now the easiest way to remember whether it's bicuspid or tricuspid, that you need to try to be right. So the tricuspid's on the right hand side of the heart. The right ventricle then wants to pump blood up and out through the pulmonary artery, which is going to send blood to the lungs. Now, the last thing we need to talk about here is the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves do what all the other valves do, which is stop blood flowing backwards. And you find the semilunar valves both at the start of the pulmonary artery and the start of the aorta. So this set of valves here and this set here are both called the semilunar valves. This part then just shows which side of the heart carries oxygenated blood, which is this side. And then the blue side carries deoxygenated blood. Now, this sort of shows you a really fast animation of what's actually happening. If you watch this carefully, you can see the blood comes in the veins, and that happens at both sides. It then travels from the atria down through the valves into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles it travels up and out in the arteries. And this part just shows you what the valves do. So remember, we've got two sets. Over at this side, we've got the bicuspid valves. Over at this side, we've got the tricuspid. And that is one set of AV valves. We have also got this set here and this set here, which are the semi-lunar valves. So the bicuspid and tricuspid separate the atrium from the ventricles, and the semilunar valves separate the ventricles from the arteries. Now, this just shows us the exterior view of the heart. So remember, over here is the right hand side, here's the left hand side. So what we can see here is the right atrium. Coming into that is the vena cava. Here we've got the coronary arteries, and they supply oxygen and glucose to the heart tissue itself. We've also got the aorta here. Now the aorta comes out of the left ventricle, which takes up most of this area. So that means that this area here is the right ventricle. So blood basically comes in, vena cava, right atrium, into the right ventricle, and then up and out through this vessel, which is the pulmonary artery. Now, if we just spin this around a bit, we can see this as if we're looking at the back of the heart. So now, this side is the left hand side, this is the right. So we can see in here, this would be the pulmonary veins, bringing blood into the left atrium, and then it goes down into the left ventricle, where it can be pumped up and out. Oh, pardon me. Can be pumped up and out from the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then up and out into the aorta. So going back to the inside of the heart then, here's what we can see. Now this is a lovely little animation. We can see here that this vessel here and this one here, these are the pulmonary veins. They bring blood back from the lungs. They enter the left atrium. It flows through the bicuspid valve. It goes into the left ventricle and then pumps blood up through the semilunar valve here. So this is the semilunar valve. And then it actually goes in behind and up and out there in the aorta. At the other side of the heart, what we can see here is the vena cava. And there's the vena cava at the bottom. It brings blood into the right atrium, and it travels through the tricuspid valve, which is here, into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pumps blood up and out through the semilunar valves, and then out, and this is going to go to the lungs, so this is the pulmonary artery. Other things that we can see here is the septum right in the middle, and we can also see the walls of the left ventricle and the wall of the right ventricle. Now, a couple of things to note here. We talked about the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve. So there's the tricuspid. Now, they're called the bi and the tricuspid because the bicuspid valve connects to the heart walls in two places, which is why it's called the bicuspid, whereas the tricuspid connects in 1, 2, 3 places, which is why it's called the tricuspid valve. These semilunar valves are called this because they look like half moon shapes. Now, another thing to note here is that if you compare the thickness of the left ventricle wall with the thickness of the right ventricle wall, you'll notice that the left ventricle is thicker than the right. There's two main reasons for that. Firstly, the left ventricle has to pump blood further than the right, and that's because the left ventricle will pump it to the rest of the body, whereas the right ventricle will only pump it to the lungs. So the left ventricle has to pump it further. The second thing is, because the left ventricle has to pump blood further, it also has to pump at a higher pressure. Now, that's really important because it needs to go to high pressure to make sure that all the glucose and oxygen can get delivered to all the cells really, really quickly. Now, what you can do just to test your knowledge here is pause this video and try and label each of these. Now, all you have to do is make a list, 1 to 9. You can do it on whiteboard, scrap it on paper, just pause it here, see if you can work out what each part is, and then I'll show the solutions. So this is the solutions then. So if we start with here, number 1 was the aorta, because it's carrying blood out of the left ventricle and up and away. This was the pulmonary vein. People will get this mixed up quite a lot. Then just remember this is the left hand side of the heart, so it's the left atrium. This actually just shows a label for the valves, so it doesn't really specify between bicuspid and semilunar. Then we've got the left ventricle. Then over at this side, we've got the right ventricle. We've got the vena cava. Now in this case, there's only one shown. The next little part is the right atrium, which is this area here. And then we've got the pulmonary artery coming up and out there, and that's going to carry blood to the lungs. Now we're getting close to the end of this little section. So what we've talked about here is the heart valves, which stop the backflow of blood and ensure that the heart acts as a unidirectional pump. Now that basically means that it pumps blood one way. Now, another important point here is that we're saying that the heart pumps 70 beats per minute, and it's made possible because the cardiac muscle, which is in the heart wall, never tires as long as it gets a constant supply of glucose and oxygen. Final important point is that humans and other mammals have a double circulatory system. Now, this means that the blood has to travel through the heart twice on one circulation of the body. Now, if you look at this, this shows the double circulation. So, we've got blood in the lungs here. It travels from the lungs back to the heart, to the left atrium, in the pulmonary veins. It then travels from the left atrium to the left ventricle, up and out in the aorta. It goes to the rest of the body, delivers its oxygen, and travels back to the heart in the vena cava. And then when it gets into the right atrium, it travels into the right ventricle and then up and out the pulmonary artery and back to the lungs. Now, we should have actually done that in blue. So, for it to get around the body once, it had to enter the heart twice. It had to go, if this is our starting point, start. For it to get around the body once, it has to go lungs, heart, body, heart, lungs, and that's where it ends. So that's why it's described as a double circulatory system. Now this is just showing the outside of the heart. So we've got the aorta, which is here. We've got the pulmonary artery here, which is coming out of the right ventricle. So if you imagine blood's flowing up and out there. We've got the left atrium, which is going to carry blood into the left ventricle. These little vessels on the outside, as we said, are the coronary arteries. And then over at this side, we've got the vena cava, which carries blood into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and then up and out in the pulmonary artery. Now again, here's another little diagram. Pause the video here and see if you can label each of these parts. So here they are. This is the vena cava, which is carrying blood down into the right atrium. It then travels through the tricuspid valve and goes into the right ventricle. The blood then travels up through here and out through the pulmonary artery, and then it will go to the lungs, and it will come back to the lungs in the pulmonary veins, and it will enter the left atrium. It'll travel through the bicuspid valve. It'll enter the left ventricle, and then it'll travel up and out, if you follow this white arrow, in the aorta. And the final little part is this bit in the middle, which is the septum. Final section of this booklet then is all about exercise and heart rate. So this shows the heart rate of two people when they're resting, when they're exercising, and afterwards when they're resting. Now, what we can see here, if this is person 1, this is person 2, what they've had done is that they've had their pulse rate measured. Now that was while they're at rest, so they're just sitting, just chilling, just relaxing, but then they've started to exercise around about here. And then once they've finished exercising, which is about there, they've started to rest again. Now here's what we can see. There's a couple of things. In the first section, we can see the person number 1 has got a higher heart rate than person number 2. This would suggest that they're less fit. Now we'll get on to why that is later on. During exercise, person 1's heart rate rises much more than person 2 by about this much. Then when they stop exercising, you can see person 2's drops really quickly, whereas person 1's takes a longer time to return to normal. It's only really at about this point that person 1 has returned to normal, whereas person 2's heart rate has returned to normal much sooner. So there's lots of things going on here. Now, if we look at a few wee questions here, what's recovery time and how does it vary for people who take a lot of exercise? The recovery rate is the time it takes for the pulse or the heart rate to return to normal after exercise. This is usually shorter for people who exercise or play a lot of sport. So if you look at this, we'll get rid of all my writing here. The recovery time for person 1 would be the time it takes to get from here, where they stop exercising, to here, which is where it goes back to normal. So that is the recovery time for person 1. Person 2 is slightly different. Person 2's recovery is between here, where they stop exercising, and here, where it returns to normal. Person 2 is clearly fitter because they've got a shorter recovery time. Now, what effect does exercise have on the heart rate, and why is this necessary? Well, everybody knows that when you exercise, your heart rate goes up, but we forget to explain the important details. So when we exercise, it's because our muscles need more oxygen for respiration. Now, it's really important that we need to say oxygen for respiration, because when you exercise, you use more energy. So to get the energy to do that, you need to rely on respiration in your cells. To carry out respiration, you need oxygen. So if you ever get asked, why does exercise increase the heart rate? It's because your muscles need more oxygen for respiration to release more energy. Now, let's say for example you got a question on this where we're comparing Jane and Gemma. Now, let's ignore all this writing for now. Let's just say we had to describe the trends here, right? So here's some trends that we'd say. Jane has a higher resting pulse rate than Gemma. And that's because here, Jane's is higher than Gemma's. The second trend is Jane's heart rate increases more than Gemma's. Now, if you look at this, there's a bigger difference between Jane's highest heart rate and Gemma's. The third trend we can see then is all about recovery. So at this point, Gemma's heart rate has returned to normal. At this point, Jane's has returned to normal. So the third trend we would say then is Gemma has a shorter recovery time than Jane. And that's the end of this topic. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.